So my guest today is Laura Richman. She's a professor at Duke University. She's going to talk to us a little bit about the relationship between discrimination and health outcomes. Laura, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure.
So I'd like to start all of these by just asking, what are the research questions that most guide your work?
Well, I would say I'm primarily interested in understanding health disparities, both what leads to health disparities and what kinds of interventions are effective to attempt to eliminate them.
Okay. And in class, we went over one of your papers looking at a meta-analysis of the association between experience discrimination and health outcomes. And in this model, you have kind of two pathways by which people can have a connection between discrimination and worse health outcomes. One of them is just the stress induced by discrimination, and stress is bad for many reasons, and that can be detrimental to health. The other is through discrimination maybe leading to more engagement in more risky behaviors, such as drinking or smoking, that might themselves impact health directly. And so, I mean, there's a lot of support for both of those pathways, it seems, but I wanted to follow up on something that you kind of just briefly noted in the paper about what do you think is the relationship between these two pathways? Is it kind of an either-or situation where you're either kind of just experience the stress and maybe not engage in those behaviors to remedy that stress, like smoking or drinking? Is it both? People who feel stress are then kind of driven to engage in these risky behaviors? So can I just get you to speculate a little bit about the relationship between those two pathways?
Yeah, I like that question a lot because it's one that always sort of lingers in my mind as I'm doing this work. And it's one that's, I think, ripe for future research. There's pretty limited work on that right now. As you mentioned, there's a lot of evidence for both of those pathways sort of as separate pathways, but putting them together, I think is really important to do. And I think I cited in that chapter some work that Alyssa Epple has done on eating responses to stress. And the idea is that people have a physiological response to this stress and they consume certain types of food, high caloric food, in response to that physiological reaction. And so that speaks to an interaction between our stress response and our behavior. And, you know, I think this is really important work to continue to do. And, you know, it's complicated. It's not sort of as neat as looking at just one pathway. Right. But I think there are creative ways that that kind of work can be done.
Can I get you to follow up on that? Just, you know, if you had unlimited resources and really great tools of measurement, like what might a study look like in terms of narrowing down what comes first in terms of the interplay between these two pathways?
Well, you know, I think there are different methodologies that are probably more ideal than experimental work to get at that. So something like experience sampling, so is your class familiar with that methodology? Have you touched on that at all?
I will be sure to go over it in this class now that we're talking about it right now.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I guess, you know, you can sort of compare it to like diary methods. So, you know, kind of having people track over a given period of time their experiences. And we've done some work on that. I mean, honestly, it's really a beast to do because it's just very messy data. So, you know, we've had people have their blood pressure monitored over a 24-hour period of time. And then they also were tracking their social experiences. We also had people do something that was a little less labor intensive where they're checking in online on a daily basis. And we had like these end of the day reports and they reported on their experience during the day. And that was for self-report stress experiences, experiences of interpersonal discrimination and conflict, affective experiences. So we're able to get a set, oh, and also health behaviors, I'm sorry. So we're able to try to connect how they responded to these experiences, these negative experiences, and their behaviors. And, you know, we found some nice associations, but we tracked them for 7 days.
Okay.
And, you know, you think about how much kind of conflict, these were college students, how much they have in the course of a week. And, you know, I don't think that was enough time to really like capture the depth of experiences that people have in their interpersonal interactions. So I think that's something that needs to be examined over a longer period of time. I guess this is all to say that yes, I think that these kinds of measurements can be done, and using a diary type methodology, I think, is probably the most promising way, but I think it's hard to do.
Sure, of course.
Yeah.
Actually, jumping off of something that you mentioned there, another point that you raised in this chapter, going off this idea that in order to really capture these effects, you might have to measure people over a longer period of time, is this idea that what might actually be more detrimental to health is repeated exposure to subtler forms of discrimination rather than smaller instances of more blatant discrimination. So do you agree with that summary of the claim in the paper?
Yeah, that it's more this kind of ambiguous, subtle, unexpected kinds of experiences that seem to be most impactful. Yeah.
Okay, can I get you to just kind of tease that apart? Because I found that to be a really interesting idea. So it's just the idea that, so go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting too, because in some ways it's kind of counterintuitive, right? I mean, you would think that, you know, if someone says something offensive to you that's based on an identity you have, that would be the most impactful, that you would feel, you know, a set of negative emotions and that you would have a physiological response. But, you know, it ends up that, you know, people are able to, I think, put those kinds of experiences in a certain place to some extent, and they're able to understand those experiences, I guess, in a way that is less stressful than the experiences that are more ambiguous. So, you know, if someone makes an offensive comment to you based on identity, you know, an easy response or an adaptive response often is to, you know, attribute that to racism, sexism, homophobia, whatever it is. Right. And so that kind of puts it on that person as being biased. Whereas when it's a more ambiguous kind of situation, it's unclear, you know, a lot of thought needs to go into understanding what just happened, why it happened, is it going to happen again? Is this because I'm a woman? Is this because I'm, you know, whatever other identities one may have? And I think it's that process of understanding what just happened and the ambiguity of the experience that can be very taxing.
Sorry, so
and I think it puts it on the person much more.
So when it's more blatant, of course, in the moment, it's probably going to feel worse, but there might not be this lingering component of having to keep ruminating about it. And it's potentially when it's more subtle that you keep continuing to ruminate about it, that you might engage in these other types of behaviors that are unhealthy to alleviate that rumination.
I think that's,
very interesting.
I think that's a nice way of summarizing it.
So again, kind of going off of what you mentioned earlier, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it does seem like a lot of this research is on subjective perceptions of discrimination. And obviously that's something that's important in its own right and certainly has its own impact on health behaviors. But it does seem like this question of more objective measures of discrimination. I know maybe you can get it in the lab, but you'd also probably want to see it in the real world. And, are you hopeful at all in new directions or new methodologies or technologies that might be able to capture this idea of objective discrimination? Or do you think that objective discrimination, it's going to take a more conceptual changes to before we can really measure that well? So I guess another way of rephrasing this, are you really hopeful that we can tackle this question about how to measure objective discrimination out in the real world?
Um, I don't consider that to be a priority, frankly,
Okay,
for
sure.
this work, because I think that if we are trying to achieve some kind of objective measure of discrimination, I'm not even quite sure how we would go about doing that, nor do I think that's necessarily a priority for this work. I think there's a great deal of value in understanding people's subjective experiences. If you compare discrimination, which I often do in my writing, with, just a more generic experience of stress.
Hmm.
Um, the stress research in its infancy was really trying to quantify and put a sort of value on certain kinds of stressors. So if you experience a death in the family, that's a 10. If you experience a breakup with your boyfriend or girlfriend, that's an 8. There's some sort of spectrum of stressors, and that there's an objective truth to it. And I don't think that that's what the research has sort of borne out over the years. That it's very much people's subjective experiences that matter, and their perceived capacity to cope with these experiences. So, I think a follow-up question that I often get about this work is, well, so, if you're measuring subjective experiences, people's perceived discrimination, how do we know that, there aren't just certain kinds of personality types that are more likely to perceive discrimination, right? So people who are, just sort of angry people, or misanthropes, or just kind of like, have a lot of conflict in their lives and sort of perceive relationships as being more hostile. And I think just research-wise, in how we design our studies, we can account for that. And I have in many of my experimental studies, we do measure personality type as a way to sort of counter that criticism. So we measure things like cynicism and hostility and neuroticism, and we control for those in our designs so that we're able to look like, all right, so we take out that other interpretation, essentially, and sort of over and above that. So even if you do have that tendency to be more neurotic or hostile, we still find that these effects hold of discrimination and these negative
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, that's a great answer, obviously. I think it's worth, for someone like me who's so maybe obsessed with methods, I really find this question about how do we measure something well to be so captivating. And so when I read your work, I'm like, okay, so there's this challenge here of objective discrimination, and my mind is racing in terms of if we give people, microphones that they can pick up on how people talk to them over time, and we can code that and get some sort of measure for objective discrimination. But at the end of the day, like, you're right, well, does it really matter? It's worth asking that question. What really matters seems to be the subjective experience of this treatment, because that's what's most tied to these stress responses, and that's what's most tied to these health outcomes. So do we really need to invest all these resources in getting something more objective when it's really the subjective experience itself that seems to be driving these outcomes? So that was very well put. I guess that.
I mean, that's my, that's, I guess, my bias, and not everyone would agree with that, certainly.
I guess so. Another question that I had reading your paper was, the meta-analysis looked across multiple different types of discrimination. And maybe there wasn't enough data in the meta-analysis to really dig deep into potential moderators there. So it does seem like all forms of discrimination are tied to worse health outcomes. But can I get you to speculate a little bit about maybe in the future, or maybe in other research where we've uncovered potential moderators of this relationship, or certain discrimination coming from for example, based on certain categories, based on your race versus based on your gender, or even coming from different people, as if it's coming from someone close to you versus coming from someone more distant to you. Can I get you to speculate a little bit about when we might see discrimination to be more impactful on health?
Well, yeah, it would be speculating because the data just, we really can't tease that apart. I think that was, we did an earlier meta-analysis that was more comprehensive, that the chapter that your class read is sort of a follow-up on it. And the original meta-analysis, that was kind of like the finding that I think a lot of people grabbed onto, was that discrimination seems to be negative for people's health, and it doesn't seem to matter what kind of discrimination, other than the sort of more acute versus chronic. Now, having said that, this work is also it has traditionally been very focused on racial discrimination. Mm-hmm. And, I would say only in the last, I don't know, maybe 7 years or so has the work really expanded to other kinds of identities, particularly sexual discrimination and weight discrimination. So, I think the field will continue to examine other identities. Which ones seem to matter more. I think that also gets to this point of intersectionality that I touched on some in the paper, that, we may find that it's not a one identity, that it actually really matters when you look at the intersection of race and class, for instance, or gender and race. Mm-hmm. I think those are going to become the more interesting kinds of questions to examine as this field moves forward.
Okay. So I guess we've already touched on this a couple of different ways, but is there a particular area, a line of work or area in this question about the relationship between discrimination and health that really excites you at the moment, that you're most interested in?
So I really, I grew up as a social psychologist with kind of one foot in the door of public health. So, I have my PhD in social psych, but I did a postdoc in health psych, and I worked in public health, and I'm now in a population health department. And so, I'm very versed in this interpersonal discrimination, and that's largely been what I've studied. But, I think understanding these larger structural and institutional forms of discrimination and how they intersect with interpersonal discrimination, I think is just really essential to understand. So, we can know that in day-to-day interactions, discrimination matters for our health, but there are many types of discrimination that we may not even be consciously aware of. We may not understand how we're not getting promoted in the way that other people are, or that we're living in certain areas that have more environmental toxins, and that matters for our health in ways that I think we need to further examine. Yeah. So I guess that's people in public health are doing more of this kind of structural examination of discrimination in health, but I think social psychologists need to also lend our expertise to examine both of these levels, both structural and interpersonal.
Right. Yeah, well, you'll get no argument from me on the importance of that topic. I think you can see it reflected in national or international conversations that we're having about the moment in terms of recognizing the structural impact on disparities. And I think that's going to be something that social psychologists really need to work on in the next 10 years to come. Thinking of, we've been trained so much to focus on just the individual mind, but of course, in order to have more impactful work, we need to recognize how that mind is understanding or recognizing or contributing to these structural disparities. So obviously, I really agree with that answer. I really
Yeah.
want to thank you for your time, Laura. This was very fun and educational, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jordan. Great talking to you.
Nice to talk to you too.